The storm raged over Manhattan, drenching the city in icy sheets of rain. Adrian Calloway barely glanced up as he stepped out of his sleek black Aston Martin, shaking off the rain from his tailored coat. He had just finished a high-stakes meeting that added another million to his ever-growing fortune, but tonight, none of it mattered. His mind was consumed with frustration. His life, for all its wealth and success, felt painfully empty. He had everything: a penthouse overlooking Central Park, a business empire at just 28, and a reputation that made men respect him and women throw themselves at him. And yet, none of it meant anything. As he strode up the marble steps of his building, something caught his eye. A woman sat curled on the cold pavement, pressed against the side of the building for shelter. Her clothes were soaked through, her long dark hair plastered to her pale face. She hugged herself, shivering violently. Adrian wasn't the type to stop for strangers. He had learned that the world was cruel and people only looked out for themselves. But something about her made him pause. Maybe it was the raw vulnerability in her eyes or the way she held herself like she was used to being invisible. He exhaled sharply. "Don't get involved, Adrian." But before he could walk away, lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating her face for just a second. And that was enough. "Come inside," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. The woman's head snapped up, her wide brown eyes filled with fear and disbelief. "What? You'll freeze to death out here." He jerked his chin toward the entrance. "I have a guest room." She hesitated, her body still trembling. I don't know you." "And I don't know you," he countered, arching a brow. "But I'm not about to let you die on my doorstep." She stared at him like she expected this to be some kind of trick, but after a few seconds she nodded, her movements slow and cautious. Adrian didn't say another word as he led her inside. The warmth of his penthouse hit her like a wave as soon as they stepped in. The space was massive, sleek, and modern floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering skyline, and expensive artwork lined the walls. The place screamed wealth. She stood there, dripping onto the polished floors, looking completely out of place. Adrian shrugged off his coat, draping it over a chair before turning to her. "You're soaked." "You need dry clothes." She nodded stiffly, her arms still wrapped around herself. He disappeared down the hall, returning with a fresh black hoodie and a pair of sweatpants. "Bathrooms down the hall." She hesitated before taking the clothes, her fingers brushing against his for the briefest second. Her skin was ice cold. She left without a word. Adrian sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "What the hell are you doing, Calloway? You don't pick up strays." But something about her had made him break his own rules. When she returned, the oversized hoodie swallowed her, but at least she wasn't shivering anymore. "You hungry?" he asked, already heading toward the kitchen. She hesitated before nodding. He pulled out a pan and started making grilled cheese, one of the few things he actually knew how to cook. The silence between them stretched, thick with unspoken questions. After a while she spoke. "Why did you help me?" Her voice was quiet, like she wasn't used to being heard. Adrian flipped the sandwich before meeting her gaze. "Because I could." She studied him like she was trying to figure out if he was real. "People don't usually stop." He didn't respond. He knew that too well. When he set the plate in front of her, she stared at it for a long moment before picking it up, taking a small bite. Then another, and another. It wasn't until she was almost done that she finally said, "Thank you." Adrian leaned back against the counter, watching her. "What's your name?" she swallowed, looking hesitant again. "Lena." "Lena," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. "How did you end up out there?" Her fingers tightened around the edge of the plate. "It's a long story. I've got time." She stayed quiet for a moment before exhaling. "I lost my job, couldn't keep up with rent, one bad thing after another." "It happens." It was such a simple explanation for something so devastating. Adrian didn't press further. He knew what it was like to lose everything. He had been a kid when his father walked out, leaving him and his mother with nothing. He had built himself from the ground up, clawed his way to the top. But Lena, she didn't belong on the streets. He made a decision then. "You can stay here," he said. Lena's head snapped up. "What?" "Just for a while," he added quickly, "until you figure things out." Her brows drew together. "Why would you do that?" Adrian didn't know the answer. Maybe he was tired of the emptiness of his life. Maybe he wanted to prove to himself that he wasn't as cold as people thought. Or maybe, just maybe, there was something about her that he wasn't ready to walk away from. "Because I can," he said simply. Lena stared at him like she was searching for a catch. But Adrian wasn't offering anything other than a roof over her head. Finally, she nodded. Okay. It was just temporary, just until she got back on her feet. Neither of them knew it yet, but that single night would change everything. Morning light streamed through the massive windows, casting a golden glow over the penthouse. Lena stirred, disoriented by the softness of the bed beneath her. Warmth cocooned her, a stark contrast to the bitter cold she had endured for weeks. Reality hit her in fragments: the storm, the stranger with piercing blue eyes, the unexpected offer of shelter. She sat up slowly, the unfamiliar luxury around her making her stomach twist. This wasn't her world. The crisp linen sheets, the sleek furniture, the sheer stillness, it felt surreal. A part of her expected it to vanish the moment she stepped out of the room. A gentle knock at the door made her tense. "It's open," she called, her voice hoarse from disuse. Adrian entered, dressed in a charcoal button-down and tailored slacks. He looked effortlessly put together, as if he belonged in the pages of a magazine rather than standing in the doorway of a guest room he had lent to a total stranger. "You slept late," he observed. Lena rubbed her eyes. "I guess I needed it." He nodded toward the hallway. "I made coffee if you want some." She hesitated before swinging her legs over the edge of the bed, her bare feet sinking into the plush carpet. The borrowed clothes hung loosely on her frame, but at least they were clean. In the kitchen, the scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the air. Adrian handed her a mug without a word. She wrapped her fingers around the warmth, savoring the small comfort. "I should probably leave soon," she murmured, staring into the dark liquid. Adrian leaned against the counter, studying her. "And go where?" She had no answer. "I meant what I said last night," he continued. "You can stay here until you figure things out." Lena tightened her grip on the mug. "I don't want to be a burden." "You won't be." Silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. She wasn't used to kindness without conditions. People always wanted something in return. "I'll pay you back," she said finally. Adrian's lips twitched in something close to amusement. "I don't need your money, Lena. That's not the point." His eyes darkened slightly, but he didn't argue. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a black credit card, placing it on the counter. "There's no catch," he said before she could protest. "Get what you need: clothes, necessities." "Whatever." She stared at the card, then at him. "You don't even know me." "I trust my instincts." Lena wasn't sure if she should be flattered or suspicious. She had spent so long scraping by, constantly on edge, that generosity felt foreign. But she couldn't keep wearing his clothes, and the idea of walking into a store without having to count every penny made her stomach twist with longing. She reached for the card slowly, half expecting him to snatch it back. When he didn't, she curled her fingers around it, the weight of it far heavier than it should have been. Adrian checked his watch. "I have meetings all day. Take the driver if you need to go anywhere." Lena blinked. "You have a driver?" His brow arched. "You sound surprised." She huffed a laugh. "You don't exactly look like the subway type." Adrian smirked. "Not a fan of crowded spaces." She took a sip of coffee, letting the warmth chase away some of the unease. "All right. I'll be back before you are." He didn't question her. He simply nodded before grabbing his keys and heading toward the door. For the first time in a long time, Lena had choices. And it terrified her. The boutique was unlike any place she had ever stepped foot in. The moment she entered, a woman in an elegant black dress approached with a polite but assessing look. "Miss, may I assist you?" Lena hesitated, gripping the credit card in her pocket. She had spent years blending into the background, making herself small. But standing here, surrounded by racks of silk and cashmere, something shifted inside her. "Yes," she said, forcing her shoulders back. "I need a new wardrobe." The saleswoman's smile widened. "Of course, miss. Right this way." An hour later, Lena walked out of the boutique with more bags than she had ever carried in her life. She had been careful, selecting only the essentials: jeans, sweaters, a coat thick enough to fight off the cold. And yet, it still felt excessive. She slid into the back seat of the sleek black car Adrian had arranged, exhaling as she placed the bags beside her. This was temporary. It had to be. Adrian returned later than expected, exhaustion tugging at his features. The day had been filled with back-to-back meetings, negotiations that would have drained most men. But the moment he stepped into his penthouse, his eyes immediately found Lena. She was sitting on the couch, curled up with a book in her lap. The sight was oddly domestic, a stark contrast to the sharp edges of his life. "You're back late," she noted, looking up. "Meetings ran over." He loosened his tie, stepping into the living room. "Did you get everything you needed?" She nodded. "I stuck to the essentials." Adrian smirked. "You don't have to justify it." Lena bit her lip, glancing away. "It still feels strange." He studied her for a moment before walking to the bar cart and pouring himself a drink. "You'll get used to it." She tilted her head. "Is that what happened to you?" Adrian paused, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "What do you mean?" "You have all of this," she gestured around them, "but you don't seem comfortable in it." He wasn't sure whether to be impressed or annoyed that she saw through him so easily. "I built this life from nothing," he said finally. "Comfort was never the goal." Lena absorbed his words, something unreadable passing through her expression. She didn't press further, and for that, he was grateful. Instead, she closed her book and set it aside. "I'll cook dinner." Adrian arched a brow. "You cook," she smirked. "Better than you, I'm guessing." His lips quirked. "Bold assumption." She stood, stretching slightly. "We'll see." Adrian watched her disappear into the kitchen, something unfamiliar settling in his chest. Lena wasn't just surviving. She was starting to exist. And for the first time in as long as he could remember, his penthouse didn't feel quite so empty. Lena moved through the kitchen with a quiet focus, pulling ingredients from the sleek refrigerator as Adrian watched from the doorway. He wasn't sure what surprised him more, the fact that she seemed so comfortable in his space, or the fact that he liked it. He had spent years ensuring his home was a reflection of his success. Minimalistic, pristine, untouched. No one had ever challenged that. But now, the scent of sautéing garlic filled the air, and the quiet hum of Lena's presence made the penthouse feel different. She moved with practiced ease, chopping vegetables with precision. Adrian leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You've done this before," he observed. Lena smirked without looking up. "I used to cook for my mom. She worked late, so I learned fast." There was something unspoken in her words, a heaviness she didn't elaborate on. Adrian didn't press. Instead, he watched as she stirred a simmering sauce, her fingers deftly maneuvering around the kitchen like she belonged there. A strange sense of contentment settled over him. When she finally plated the meal, she slid a dish toward him, waiting expectantly. Adrian took a bite, his expression unreadable. Lena raised an eyebrow. "Well," he chewed thoughtfully before nodding. "It's good." She rolled her eyes. "That's it, just good." Adrian smirked. "I don't give compliments easily." Lena scoffed but didn't argue. Instead, she sat across from him. And for the first time in years, Adrian found himself sharing a meal that wasn't eaten alone or in a sterile business setting. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. If anything, it felt natural. After a few bites, Lena set her fork down. "You never told me what you do." Adrian wiped his mouth with a napkin before answering. "Investments, acquisitions. I build companies, buy failing ones, and turn them around." Lena tilted her head. "So you fix broken things?" Adrian stilled, her words striking deeper than he expected. He had never thought of it that way, but maybe she wasn't wrong. "Something like that," he admitted. Lena studied him for a moment before picking up her fork again. "Seems fitting." Adrian didn't ask what she meant. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. Later that evening, as Lena rinsed the dishes, Adrian leaned against the counter watching her. "You don't have to do that," he said. She shrugged. "It's only fair. You let me stay, I cook and clean, it's an even trade." Adrian frowned slightly. "It's not a trade, Lena." She dried her hands on a towel, meeting his gaze. "Maybe not to you." Something about the way she said it made his chest tighten. Lena wasn't someone who took things without giving something back. She had a quiet strength, a resilience that intrigued him. She wasn't trying to impress him, wasn't expecting anything in return, and that was dangerous. Because Adrian had built his life around transactions, power, money, influence. Everything came with a price. But Lena, she wasn't playing by those rules. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure what to do about it. The next morning, Adrian woke earlier than usual, expecting to find Lena still asleep. Instead, he stepped into the living room and found her standing by the massive windows, staring out at the city. She didn't hear him approach. "You like the view?" he asked. Lena turned slightly, arms folded over her chest. "It's different from down there." Adrian moved beside her, following her gaze to the skyline. "How so?" she exhaled slowly. "Up here, everything looks perfect, but on the streets you see the cracks. The things people don't want to acknowledge." Adrian glanced at her, noting the distant look in her eyes. "You don't belong there," he said quietly. Lena let out a soft, humorless laugh. "Sometimes it's not about belonging. Sometimes life just happens." Adrian didn't argue. He had seen firsthand how quickly things could fall apart, but he also knew the power of rebuilding. He turned to her. "You don't have to go back." Lena met his gaze, something unreadable flickering in her expression. "It's not that simple," she murmured. Adrian held her stare, his jaw tightening. "It could be." Lena didn't answer. Instead, she turned back to the window, as if trying to see something beyond the glass. Adrian knew then that she wasn't just looking at the city. She was looking for a way forward. And for the first time, he wondered if he could be a part of it. Adrian's penthouse felt different now. He noticed it in the small details, the faint scent of coffee lingering in the air even after he left for the office. The way a sweater of hers was draped over the back of the couch. The quiet hum of life that hadn't existed before. Lena had settled into his space in ways he hadn't anticipated. He found himself looking forward to coming home, an unfamiliar feeling. The long, grueling hours at the office felt less suffocating when he knew she would be there. She wasn't just existing in his world, she was shaping it, shifting the edges of his carefully controlled life without even realizing it. Tonight was no different. He stepped into the penthouse to find her curled up on the sofa, her legs tucked beneath her as she flipped through a book. She looked up when she heard him, her lips curving into a smile, small but real. Something in his chest tightened at the sight. He set his briefcase down, loosening the top button of his shirt. "You're still up," she shrugged. "Couldn't sleep." Adrian watched her for a moment before sinking into the chair across from her. The silence between them was comfortable, charged with something neither of them had dared to name. Lena glanced at him, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the edge of the book. "You work too much." He smirked, resting his elbow on the armrest. Occupational hazard. You don't have to do it all alone, you know. Adrian's expression shifted slightly, something flickering behind his eyes. She always had a way of cutting through him, of seeing past the walls he had spent years perfecting. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. And what would you suggest? Lena tilted her head, considering him. Maybe letting someone in once in a while. His jaw tightened, but not in frustration. It was something else, something dangerously close to vulnerability. She wasn't wrong. For years, his life had been built on control, on ensuring no one could ever get close enough to hurt him. But Lena had slipped through the cracks without even trying, and he wasn't sure he wanted to stop her. Without thinking, he reached forward, brushing a strand of hair away from her face. Her breath hitched, her eyes locking onto his. Something shifted in the air between them. Neither of them moved for a moment, as if caught in some invisible pull. Then, slowly, almost cautiously, Adrian leaned in. Lena didn't pull away. When his lips met hers, it wasn't rushed or desperate. It was slow, deliberate, as if they were both realizing something neither of them had been willing to admit. Her fingers curled into his shirt, pulling him closer. He responded in kind, his hand sliding to the nape of her neck, holding her like she was something precious. When they finally broke apart, their breaths mingling in the space between them, Adrian rested his forehead against hers. Lena's voice was barely above a whisper. "What are we doing?" Adrian tightened his grip on her, his voice low and certain, "Something that makes sense." She searched his eyes, looking for hesitation, for doubt. She found none. For the first time in a long time, Adrian wasn't thinking about consequences, about risks, about control. He was thinking about her, and he wasn't going to let her go. Lena stood by the kitchen island, trying to steady her heartbeat. The kiss had shifted something between them, something she wasn't sure how to navigate. She had spent so long surviving that emotions, real, deep emotions, felt foreign. But Adrian didn't look uncertain. He moved with the same confidence he always had, pouring himself a drink, watching her over the rim of his glass. There was something different in his gaze now, not just attraction, but certainty. She exhaled and ran a hand through her hair. "This is unexpected." Adrian set his glass down and leaned against the counter, his expression unreadable. "Is it?" Lena swallowed. "You don't do things without thinking them through." He smirked, but there was no amusement in his eyes. "And you don't trust things that come too easily." She couldn't argue. The weight of his words settled between them. The truth was, she had never let herself believe in something good without expecting it to be taken away. And Adrian, he wasn't just good. He was dangerous in the way that made her want to believe, to trust. But trust was a fragile thing. Adrian stepped closer, his presence commanding but not overwhelming. "Tell me what you're thinking." Lena forced a breath through her nose, her fingers gripping the edge of the counter. "That I don't know how to do this." His gaze softened, not with pity but understanding. "Then we figure it out." She searched his face, waiting for the catch, for the moment he would pull back. But he didn't. He just stood there, unwavering, as if he had already decided, long before she had. The realization sent a shiver through her. Adrian Calloway had let her into his home, into his life. And now, he was offering her something more. For the first time in years, she wasn't sure what scared her more, staying or leaving. The next few days passed in a blur of unspoken things, charged glances, and moments that lingered just a little too long. Lena tried to act like nothing had changed, but everything had. She found herself noticing the small things about Adrian, the way he rolled his sleeves up when he worked, the way he always poured her coffee before his own, the way his presence filled a room without him even trying. And Adrian, for all his usual control, wasn't hiding anything. He didn't push, didn't demand. He just existed in her space, waiting for her to meet him halfway. One evening, as she sat curled up on the couch, Adrian returned from work looking unusually tense. He loosened his tie, his jaw locked in frustration. Lena glanced up. "Bad day," he exhaled sharply and sank into the chair opposite her. "Boardroom politics." She tilted her head. "You don't seem like the type to lose control over that." His lips twitched, but there was no humor in it. "I don't. But some battles aren't worth fighting and some are." Lena studied him, noticing the tension in his shoulders. "Then why fight this one?" Adrian leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Because I built everything I have from nothing, and I won't let anyone take it from me." There it was again, that steel beneath the surface, the same fire she had seen in herself. She hesitated before saying, "You don't have to do it alone." His gaze snapped to hers, something unreadable flickering in his expression. They weren't talking about business anymore. Adrian stood and crossed the room, stopping just in front of her. He reached out, tracing his fingertips along her jaw, his touch featherlight. "I don't want to do this alone." It wasn't just about his work, it was about them. Lena's heart pounded. She had spent so long building walls, but Adrian wasn't trying to tear them down. He was waiting for her to open the door, and for the first time in years she wanted to. She reached up, placing her hand over his. "Then don't." A slow, knowing smile touched his lips. Something had finally shifted. Neither of them were alone anymore. Adrian watched Lena across the dining table, the flickering candlelight casting soft shadows across her face. Tonight something was different. The space between them felt charged, not with hesitation but with quiet understanding. He had spent years mastering control over his business, his life, his emotions. But Lena had unraveled him in ways he hadn't anticipated. She wasn't just another fleeting presence in his world. She was something permanent, something real. She twirled her fork between her fingers, her gaze flicking to him before looking down at her plate. He could see the wheels turning in her mind, the way she measured her words before speaking. "You're staring," she murmured, not looking up. Adrian smirked, leaning back in his chair. "I like what I see." Lena's lips curved slightly, but she shook her head. "You're impossible." He set his glass down and studied her, his expression turning serious. "I know what I want, Lena." She finally met his gaze, her fingers tightening around her napkin. "And what's that?" "You." The word hung between them, undeniable, absolute. A flicker of something, fear, hope, maybe both, flashed in her eyes. "Adrian, he reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers. "I'm not asking for an answer right now. But I need you to know that this isn't temporary for me." Lena inhaled sharply, her shoulders rising with the weight of his words. For so long she had been drifting, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But Adrian wasn't offering uncertainty. He was offering stability, choice, and for the first time she wanted to take it. She turned her palm up, letting her fingers curl around his. "I don't want to run anymore." Adrian's grip tightened, his thumb brushing over her skin. "Then stay." Lena exhaled, her chest rising and falling in a slow, measured breath. She had been afraid of falling, but maybe, just maybe, Adrian was the one person who would catch her. The decision settled inside her, solid and unshakable. "I will." A slow, knowing smile broke across Adrian's face. Not triumphant, not victorious, just certain, like he had known all along that she was meant to be here. And for the first time in years, Lena didn't feel like she was standing on the edge of something uncertain. She was exactly where she was meant to be. 2 months later, the penthouse no longer felt like just Adrian's space, it was theirs. Lena had settled into his life seamlessly, not as a guest, but as something far more permanent. Adrian had never envisioned a life where someone shared his world so completely, but Lena had become the one thing he hadn't known he was missing. Tonight they stood on the terrace, overlooking the city, the lights stretching endlessly before them. Adrian wrapped an arm around her waist, pulling her close. Lena sighed against his chest. It still doesn't feel real sometimes. He pressed a kiss against her hair. It's real, Lena. She tilted her head up, her gaze searching his. You changed my life. Adrian smirked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. You changed mine first. Lena smiled, leaning into him. I love you. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of everything they had been through. Adrian's grip tightened, his voice low, steady. I love you too. And just like that, the last of Lena's fears melted away. She wasn't running anymore, she was home.